Hello everyone, today I will be making the tentative conclusion video for my Jewish History of Madagascar series. If information becomes more available in English on this subject, then I might remake the video. But now, as the book of Ecclesiastes says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. It's 70 CE. A Jewish refugee takes one last look at his ancestral homeland. It's the last time he will ever see it. If he does return, he will return to ruins. Titus' legions are pressing on towards Jerusalem. They will take the temple, desecrate it, and destroy Jerusalem.
This was the city of Agrippa. This was the city of Herod. This was the city of Alexandra, of the Maccabees, of Ezra and Nehemiah, of David. And on the 26th of September, 70 CE, Jerusalem was dead.
Over 1 million Jews would lose their lives over the course of this conflict, but among the lucky survivors would be a man named Alitorat. He would go to Mecca, convert to Islam, and start speaking Arabic, then go to Madagascar and start a Jewish community. In case you hadn't noticed yet, everything after the destruction of the temple in the previous narrative was questionable, if not fictitious at best. Let's try another approach. There are multiple theories at play here. Let's have some fun going through them all. Okay, so you heard the first theory. Let's go on to a slight variation of that. Some theorize that there were Muslim merchants or sailors who were forcibly converted to Islam, then reverted to Judaism once on the island. This is basically just a theory where we have a lot of alliterates and a lot of time in order to make things more plausible. I will say that there are genetic studies confirming Middle Eastern genetics in some of the island's population, although these are limited to Arab populations, which are known to have inhabited Madagascar from its early days of settlement. Buckle your seatbelts, because this is about to get crazy. Some theorize that Israelites paddled to India, then to Indonesia, and maybe Australia, then over to Madagascar. First off, I wasn't aware that Israelites rode halfway across the world and back. How exactly did this happen? And when? And where are the genetic markers to prove it? Another question that comes up is why they didn't stop and establish intermediate Jewish communities along the way. The geography of what they did makes no sense and has no antique attestation. In fact, there are only 2 publicly available inscriptions to support this. More about the proposed inscriptions later. There's also a variant of the Israelite mythos where, due to various occurrences, including the Israelites seeking rosewood for Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, they wound up settling in Madagascar. If you know the biblical account well, you'll know that Hiram, king of Tyre, provided cedar wood from Lebanon, which was renowned in the ancient world for its quality, for the construction of the Jerusalem temple. Given this, it is totally inexplicable why Solomon would send his fleet from southern Israel to a remote African island in search of wood. Why and how a community of Israelites would have developed on the island remains unexplained, and as we will see, explanations upholding the veracity of these narratives are highly questionable. Some people in Madagascar actually believe that ancient tribes on the island were Jewish. Not simply that some Jews landed on the island and had some kids, but that whole historical tribes that conquered and inhabited large portions of the island were Jewish. These are enormous claims, but they do not hold up to scrutiny. I asked a Jewish history YouTuber named Sam Arno to do a special on this topic. Here's what he said. There seems to be a mix here of lost tribes mythos and an actual small population relating to the escape from Portugal. So in short, these stories are part of the larger Lost 10 Tribes mythos, or made-up identity stories, that non-Jewish populations adopted because of colonization. Not to make my channel sound like history class, but we're about to talk about colonization for a second. Colonization was a process where world powers carved up the world and took it over. Madagascar went to France. As with most European powers, France brought with them the Bible, the knowledge of which they gave to the locals. The French in the colonial period also would have used the Bible to explain the origins of these conquered peoples, as historical interpretations of Genesis assert that all people on the earth are descended from Adam. Seeing various practices in place in Africa that the colonizers had only seen before practiced by Jews may have formed a notion in the minds of the colonizers that they then would have spread to the locals. Before colonization, it is unlikely that there would have been Christians on the island. Today, more than 85% of the population is Christian. including many who believe the original populations of the island were Jewish. The colonial narrative took hold, and true or not, is believed by many in Madagascar today. But people seldom believe things so long without a reason. So now let's deal with the evidence. The easiest way to prove claims of ancient Israelite or Jewish presence is to provide material culture that clearly demonstrates their presence. In other words, the easiest way to provide evidence that there were ancient Jews on the island is to have a West Semitic artifact, Star of David, or Hebrew writing show up there in the archaeological record. Sadly, there is also a 3-step process used to forge evidence of this sort. First, someone gets a chisel. Second, someone goes to a World Heritage Site or other site of historic significance on the island. Third, they deface part of the site with Hebrew graffiti. Before getting offended, it is important to note the epigraphic interpretations of these proposed inscriptions. These so-called ancient Hebrew inscriptions, which are often incorrectly claimed to be Paleo-Hebrew or Proto-Hebrew, are detectable forgeries and hardly sufficient to prove the claims of some Malagasy that up to 80% of the population of the island may be Hebraically descended. The first inscription is what I will call King Julian I, or KJ1. On screen is the epigraphic mock-up of the inscription. As you can see, there appear to be dageshim, or dageshes, and potentially cantillation marks, or vowel points, layered on to the Hebrew text of the word holy, or kadosh. The kaf, on the other hand, appears to be an archaic variant that would match with an early date for the inscription. The vowel points, however, would place this inscription at a late date, at earliest medieval. This mixed system writing style, combined with an unconfirmed location for the inscription and its presentation by someone who likely has competencies to fabricate something on this level, made it suspicious at least. A professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in their classics department offered the opinion that the inscription was something called a pietistic forgery. In simple terms, someone was so desperate for evidence that they made a fake inscription. This claim that a devotee to the hypothesis of Hebraic origins of the Malagasy made a fake inscription is very plausible, especially given the fact that this inscription is one word of only 3 letters. If this text showed any level of Hebrew grammar or syntax, it would be more believable. But realistically speaking, I could make a better forgery than this, that could look more accurate than this. And I have 0 formal education in any Semitic language excluding modern Duolingo Hebrew. Until further evidence can be brought out to corroborate this find, including where on earth this inscription is located, it is highly suspect and should be treated as a forgery. There are 2 other inscriptions specifically discussed by Nathan Dever in his book chapter on Malagasy origins, a work published about African Judaism. There is supposedly one messianic inscription which says Elohim Hashem Yeshua Mashiach. As much as I would like this inscription to be antique, an attestation to Torah-keeping, Jesus-believing God followers, the addition of a resh in the inscription apparently aligns it with the modern local French accent found in the area. That inscription is also a forgery. The third inscription I'm aware of relating to their claims is an etching, which I was not able to find, which seems to be Malagasy Arabic cursive, if anything coherent at all. There are also claims of an inscription in the southwest of the island. This, if true, would support the Israelite arrival hypothesis via an eastern route. This inscription also could not be found. Even with AI assistance, I could not locate the locality it was supposed to be in with certainty. There's also another inscription I found recently which says Hara, a word which appears in a prominent passage of Isaiah. The style is definitively modern and lacks any grammatical or syntactic context. The chisel method could forge something of this caliber given enough time and skill. We have nothing to validate this inscription based on. It is a common Hebrew word. It could easily be a forgery, and its context in a questionable and unknown location harms its case. There is simply insufficient information for any of these inscriptions to be considered proof of anything. Right now, some of these inscriptions are claims themselves. One other item cited as proof that we should be aware of is some linguistic and cultural similarities. There are some similar sounding words and cultural practices between the Hebrew language and culture and that of the Malagasys. A scroll through Wikipedia will reveal some claimed examples, although this could derive from other Middle Eastern or even other Semitic influences besides Jews or Israelites. One of the more interesting so-called proofs is a Malagasy musical instrument that some say comes from the harp of David. Its name is noted as one similarity between the Malagasy and Hebrew culture. These connections, however, are simply curios, not enough proof to stand a historical theory of cross-continental migration over land and sea on, not enough to convince the world, but enough to convince many Malagasy. So just what are these connections? Is there something underlying the ancient practices that caused the West to think these people were Jewish? I would argue that there is. The meat taboos, animal sacrifice, spring festival, and other practices present in the indigenous cultures hark back to ancient cultural memories. I would argue that this cultural memory is the first giving of the commandments of God, not at Mount Sinai, but to the first humans, maybe even the first man. We know that these food taboos existed from before the time of Moses. Ancient archaeology at Semitic cities joined with God's distinction between clean and unclean animals when God was commanding Noah what animals to bring in the ark demonstrate this. Noah existed before the Israelite or Jewish nation. As such, the cultural memory and distinction between clean and unclean belongs not to the Hebrews, but to the whole world, Malagasy included. We see this in other instances of God's commandments revealed before Sinai in the biblical narrative and elsewhere. For example, the archaeology of Avaris, an ancient Semitic city, shows bone deposits which indicate the residents likely had a biblically clean diet due to the low concentrations of unclean animal bones there. The site was dated to before the Exodus, ensuring that the law given at Sinai had not reached them yet, because it would not be given until years after the date of the site's abandonment. There are other biblical references to pre- and non-Jewish observance of the law of God. So is it any wonder that there would also be historical and cultural preservations of the commandments of God to mankind? Please take what I'm about to say the right way. A large core of the first 5 books of the Bible is not, and never was, exclusively Jewish in nature. Malagasy practices that resemble Judaism are just one more piece of evidence for this eternal truth. So let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. So do the commandments of God.